By now, we've essentially reached the middle of the iceberg, and today we'll be exploring these 7 fascinating yet little-known civilizations. Pretty much all of them practiced human sacrifice for some reason. I didn't deliberately group them together because of that, it's just a coincidence, so look forward to that, I guess. I know we covered way more civilizations in each of the last 2 videos, and that's because when there's less information available about a given culture, I just get the urge to cover as much of it as I can, so we're really going to be diving deep into each of them today. If you have a passion for history and want to learn about even more forgotten civilizations, make sure to subscribe and consider joining the Patreon. You'll get early access to sections of my videos as I'm working on them, so you won't have to wait a month or 2 in between uploads. A shout out at the end of every one of my future videos and access to my complete notes and scripts. But don't worry, even if you're not a paying member, you can still check out all the links to my sources and regular updates there anyways. So without further ado, let's begin. The Maikop Culture. The Maikop culture existed between 3700 and 3000 BC during the early Bronze Age, east of the Black Sea in the northwest Caucasus, in what's now southern Russia. They're most well known for constructing huge burial mounds and filling them with truly spectacular treasures, and they had quite an impact beyond that as well. Based on similarities between their pottery, they probably succeeded the Copper Age Svobodno culture, also known as the Darkvedi Mishoko culture. Both cultures inhabited relatively small villages. It's just that the Maikop started building burial mounds, which they're most known for because they filled them with crazy amounts of bling. In fact, the whole culture takes its name from the Russian city of Maikop because the first and by far the richest Maikop burial was excavated near there in 1897. The mound it was in was over 100 meters in diameter and 11 meters high. The actual grave inside it was divided into 2 northern chambers, each containing women wearing silver foil ornaments, who were presumably human sacrifices meant to accompany the occupant of the southern chamber, a man labeled as a chieftain, or priest king. He was buried with beautifully decorated silver and gold cups, including one with the earliest depiction of a post-glacial horse, which looks a lot like a modern Przewalski horse, amidst a really neat little primitive landscape drawing. He was also buried with between 6 to 8 curious silver tubes, with 2 silver and 2 gold bowls fitted onto half of them. It was originally thought that these held up some sort of canopy, which this guy would sit under or something. They're now thought to be some of the world's first drinking straws, used to slurp up beer from big pots at communal feasts, like in Mesopotamia, which the Maikop were heavily influenced by. In fact, the 68 golden depictions of lions and 19 golden depictions of bulls, once applied to the priest king's robes, were symbols of power, likely borrowed from the Sumerians, and they also likely reflect what local rulers in Mesopotamia would have worn. And it's possible that some of these tomb goods were actually manufactured in Mesopotamia. But that of course begs the question, why the hell were these guys so far north of Mesopotamia in Russia so intimately involved with them? Well, everyone likes shiny metals, and the northern Caucasus is filled with them. And it seems that enterprising prospectors involved in the Uruk period commercial networks were willing to cross the Caucasus just to get to them. They likely first made contact with the Maikop in the West Caucasus along the coast between Maikop and Sochi, which explains why the early Kurgan burials, like Maikop itself, which were constructed between 3700 and 3400 BC, are in the west. Just to further illustrate how far-reaching these 4th millennium BC trade networks were, the Maikop priest king was also found with thousands of beads made of carnelian from Pakistan, lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, and turquoise from Iran or even Tajikistan. In the next phase of Maikop culture, lasting from 3400 to 3000 BC, more trade routes through the mountains opened up further to the east, attested to by the site of Seg-Gurdan near Lake Urmia in Iran. It was originally thought to date to the Iron Age, but it's comprised of 11 burial mounds similar to contemporary Maikop ones. Their burial chambers were the same as Maikop ones, and all the tomb goods were similar to Maikop tomb goods, even including fragments of more silver tubes. This period also saw the increased usage of arsenical bronze, which the Maikop used to make what's been deemed the earliest known sword in the world, a 61 centimeter long arsenical bronze blade found in Grave 5 of Kurgan 31 at the site of Novosvobodnaya Klady, one of the main sites from the period. This same burial also contained some of the earliest gold-capped teeth in the world, and some of the earliest forks, which had 2 prongs instead of 3. Another important discovery was made in Kurgan 28 at Klady, a painted stone slab depicting 10 black and red horses surrounding a humanoid figure, which some have identified as the Indo-Iranian death god Vayu, and other wall paintings which might depict a king's weapons. This has led to people theorizing that the Maikop are actually the original Proto-Indo-Europeans, and eventually gave rise to the Indo-European cultures in the Pontic steppe after leaving their original homeland in eastern Anatolia, or even northern Mesopotamia. But that probably isn't actually the case, especially since the area they lived in speaks non-Indo-European languages today, from the Northwest Caucasian language family. And the Maikop culture's language was probably some archaic member of it. But we do know that the Maikop definitely traded with the steppe peoples, possibly for wool, horses, or even weed. Literally, weed. And they're probably responsible for some of the Caucasian and even Semitic loanwords in Indo-European languages today. They also probably introduced the wagon, which is what made mobile living on the steppe possible, as we saw with the Yamnaya in the last video. Some of the oldest wheel traces in Europe were found in Novokorsunskaya Kurgan II, and grave 23 in Evdik Kurgan IV in Kalmykia had a bronze cauldron in it decorated with a little dotted image of a cart. We also know that the Kemi-Oba culture, those guys who made the stela the Yamnaya really liked stealing, got a lot of their arsenical bronze from the Maikop. But ultimately the Maikop were a bit too reliant on trade. When the Uruk trade networks collapsed around 3100 BC due to internal problems in Mesopotamia, the Maikop culture just couldn't cope with the loss of its customers, and came to an end, being replaced by the creatively named North Caucasus culture. The Moche. The Moche, or Mochica, inhabited various river valleys along the arid northern coast of Peru between the 1st and 8th centuries AD. They built a number of well-organized urban and ceremonial centers, the most remarkable element of which are huacas, a type of pyramid or ceremonial platform made out of adobe bricks, which were built up layer by layer over generations and often feature brightly painted murals and reliefs. The most imposing of these by far are the Huaca del Sol and the Huaca de la Luna, which are at the archaeological site of Moche, sitting in the Moche River Valley, which you can probably guess are the namesakes of the culture as a whole. The site may have once been home to 10,000 people, and at the very least controlled the neighboring 4 valleys. The Huaca del Sol is 98 feet high and covers 13 acres, but because the Spanish diverted the entire Moche River just to wash enough of it away to loot it, only a third of it actually survives to the present. But back when it was still intact, it was the largest adobe building in the Americas. The nearby Huaca de la Luna, or Pyramid of the Moon, is 105 feet high and occupies 15 acres, and it contains rather terrifying painted reliefs of the Moche's bloodthirsty principal god, who goes by various names like Ayapek, the Decapitator God, and the Octopus God. It also contained a mural depicting a procession of bound war captives being led to the top of the structure to be sacrificed to him. And archaeological evidence of that was found in 1995, when the dismembered skeletons of 70 young men were found buried in a plaza there, interspersed with little ceramic depictions of bound captives and fly eggs, showing that they'd been left out to rot for quite some time. Yeah, these guys did some pretty messed up stuff. One of the most gruesome rituals they performed is captured in the so-called presentation scene, or sacrifice ceremony, which appears on some of their line-painted pottery. It shows captives having their throats cut, and the ensuing blood being collected in a cup and presented to a warrior priest for him to drink by 3 other figures, like comically evil vampires. For future reference, let's just call the warrior priest A and the others B, C, and D. That's what the scholars do. And we know it's something that actually happened because these 4 figures, or at least people dressed as them, have actually been found within the incredibly lavish Moche royal tombs, which have been discovered just over the past few decades. In 1987, archaeologist Walter Alva was tipped off about the discovery of royal tombs at the site of Huaca Rayada, also known as Sipan, just after looters had started pillaging it. But he and the local police arrived just in the nick of time to find the richest burial ever made in the Americas, belonging to a man now known as the Lord of Sipan. He was carbon dated to the 3rd century AD, and was buried with 451 different bits of bling, made of gold, silver, copper, and turquoise, including weird stuff like a necklace made of giant gold and silver peanuts, an inverted pyramid staff, and gilded banners, which I would argue constitute some of the world's oldest flags, because why not? His whole outfit, including this headdress, and back flaps like this one, which was actually smuggled to the US and eventually intercepted by the FBI at a rest stop in New Jersey, are strikingly similar to what the warrior priest, or A in the presentation scene, is shown wearing. The occupant of the next tomb found there, Tomb 2, wore a gilded copper headdress with an owl at its center, evoking the owl-headed guy, or B, in the presentation scene. And that's the reason why this guy's called the Owl Priest. He even had a copper cup to boot, as well as a necklace made up of beads in the shape of somewhat unnerving, grinning, and frowning faces, which give serious Bahamut vibes, along with these snarling feline head beads, whose exact origins I couldn't determine. I also have to mention Tomb 3, belonging to a guy known as the Old Lord of Sipan, because he might have been one of the Lord of Sipan's ancestors. His tomb contained a number of bizarre treasures, like this crab with a human head, this incredible nose ornament of a little guy wearing his own movable nose ornament plus another owl headdress, and this necklace of spiders with human faces on webs made of gold wire. All of these guys were accompanied by the seated skeletons of guards with their feet cut off, who were presumably meant to eternally guard the tombs without ever being able to leave. In all, 14 elite tombs have been found at Sipan, the latest being in 2007, so there's still a lot the site can offer. A year later, in 2008, another incredibly rich tomb was found just 12 kilometers away, at the base of a huaca known as the Huaca El Pueblo. He's been dubbed the Lord of Ucupe, which is the nearest town, though he might have actually been subservient to the Lord of Sipan. You see, the Moche were initially considered a centralized, expansionistic state, but they're currently thought to have been divided into two northern and southern kingdoms / cultural areas, though even still, a single valley could host multiple kingdoms simultaneously, each with their own urban and ceremonial centers. The Lord of Ucupe corresponds to the guy on the far right of the presentation scene, figure D, along with the so-called Lady of Cow. She's the incredibly well-preserved mummy of a 25-year-old woman discovered 2 years earlier in 2006 at the ancient trading port of El Brujo, specifically in the brightly painted Huaca Cow Viejo. Her skin bears tattoos of snakes and spiders, and she was buried with 15 necklaces, 44 nose pieces, multiple crowns, and 2 rather impressive copper scepters. They both date to around 450 AD. And lastly, figure C corresponds with priestesses found buried at San Jose de Moro. But besides their unbelievably ballin' tombs and brutal human sacrifices, the Moche are also famous for being master potters who use their characteristically stirrup-spouted vessels to portray all manner of things, including incredibly lifelike individualized portraits depicting real people, as well as animals and stuff so raunchy I'd be banned from YouTube for showing it to you. But my favorite themes have to be these little bean people or these objects revolting against their owners. The Moche produced masterpieces of pottery like these in huge quantities, and it's thought that a whopping 80 to 100,000 of them were sitting in collections around the world, even here in Vancouver, which says a lot. And I also know that there are some pretty amazing Moche artifacts in a side room of the Seattle Art Museum, along with a bunch of other pre-Columbian treasures, and of course in the American Museum of Natural History in New York. We don't know how exactly Moche civilization ended, but it's thought to have been a combo of them being conquered by the Wari and other peoples, and environmental catastrophes, which undermine the authority of the elites. Because if you sacrifice a bunch of people without any actual effects enough times, people might just get to thinking that maybe you're the one who needs to be sacrificed. Sanxingdui. The Sanxingdui culture is a pretty recently discovered Bronze Age culture that existed in what's now southwestern Sichuan in China. Much of what we know about them come from pits from the site of Sanxingdui, which contained a number of stunning artifacts made of jade, bronze, ivory, and even gold, which had been ritually deposited in them right before the site was abruptly abandoned sometime between 1200 and 1100 BC, which was coincidentally when the Bronze Age collapse was happening in the Near East. Technically, Sanxingdui was first discovered in the 1920s by a farmer, and it was excavated a little in 1934. But the excavations that made it famous only started in 1986, when 2 pits containing a whopping 1,000 objects were discovered. The objects found there include several bizarre giant masks, some with uncanny protruding eyes, which might depict gods or ancestors, as well as some gargantuan 9-foot-tall bronze sculptures, and an intricate bronze tree, which might have represented a ladder to heaven. They had a really unique, standard way of depicting faces, eh? Prior to those excavations, the center of Bronze Age Chinese civilization was thought to be the central plains of the Yellow River, where the contemporary Shang dynasty was based, and Sichuan was just thought to be an uncivilized backwater. Although it did possess its own kingdom, the ancient kingdom of Shu, which Sanxingdui has been tentatively identified with. When the site was abandoned, a very similar culture that's almost certainly its direct continuation popped up 30 miles away at a site called Jinsha within the suburbs of the enormous modern megacity of Chengdu. It's been theorized that this was the result of an earthquake which diverted their main water source, the Minjiang River, to Jinshan. 6 other pits at the site are still being excavated, and very carefully at that. And as a result, incredibly impressive artifacts are still regularly being found there. I've even heard that a whopping 13,000 were discovered between 2020 and 2022 alone. My favorite being the so-called grand mythical creature, discovered in Pit 8, because its mouth looks like a vacuum. So it's clear that Sanxingdui still has a lot to offer. The Sanxingdui Museum in Guanghan City, near the site, reportedly attracts thousands of visitors per day, and there's a huge exhibition of 120 newly discovered Sanxingdui artifacts currently ongoing at the Hong Kong Palace Museum. The Diquís Culture. The Diquís culture existed around the Diquís Delta and the Rio Diquís, also known as the Rio Toraba, in southwestern Costa Rica. It's best known for leaving behind around 350 mysterious stone spheres, the largest of which is a whopping 2.6 meters in diameter. They were first discovered in the 30s and 40s as the United Fruit Company was clearing land to create banana plantations. But even given the last 80 years, no one's really been able to definitively figure out why they were made. Many of the spheres have been taken from their original positions and put in places ranging from gardens to museums, but the few that haven't, like at a site called Finca 6, have revealed that they were placed on large stone-lined platforms on the boundaries of graveyards and next to the ramps leading up to the high stone-walled mounds surrounding plazas atop which ancient chiefs lived. These were all located in certain political centers which emerged between 500 AD and 1550, when agriculture intensified, and the Diquís Delta was actually just a sub-area of the broader Chiriqui culture, also present in western Panama. It was also at the northernmost edge of a network of Chibchan-speaking people organized into chiefdoms stretching down into northern South America, who all produced incredible golden artwork meant to adorn their chiefs. The people of the Diquís region distinguished themselves by making exceptionally extravagant, albeit unpolished, golden artwork, which often feature human-animal hybrids standing between 2 plaques representing the upper and lower worlds, flanked by little abstract crocodile heads made of spirals and concealed by little dangling elements meant to tinkle like bells. Luckily for the people of the Diquís region, gold was present in placer deposits in their rivers and the nearby Osa Peninsula. In fact, Costa Rica is called Costa Rica, or Rich Coast, because of all the bling the Spanish saw just covering the people they met. These gold-covered chiefs controlled vast domains incorporating other lesser chiefs and had monopolies over the gold from the rivers in their territories, which wound up in Nicaragua and even Mesoamerica, like these bells from Chichen Itza. In addition to their mysterious spheres and their stunning goldwork, they also made statues of animals and humans, the latter sometimes shown wearing decapitated heads, all set up on peg bases, to be installed into the ground in their centers. Returning to the spheres, people have speculated that spheres had ceremonial or calendrical purposes, or that they were meant to reflect certain constellations, but the explanation I like most is that they're basically just meant to be the ultimate form of all the rounded river stones these people used in all of their buildings. It's also possible that different chiefs tried to one-up each other by having the most spheres possible, which makes sense when you consider how creating them required mustering up all the people needed to move them from the distant quarries they came from, and of course to shape them. Some were even shipped to nearby Caño Island. Anyways, when the Spanish came to the region in the 1560s under Juan Vasquez de Coronado, related to the Coronado from the Coronado's Cross in Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade, in 1563, they didn't record seeing the spheres because many of the centers they were in had been abandoned in 1400, and the region had descended into a state of constant warfare. Smaller chiefdoms and centers inhabited by over 1,000 people still existed though, but in the wake of the Spanish conquest, they too were abandoned, and the people fled to the hills. Oh, and beyond the Coronados, there's another pretty obvious connection to Indiana Jones. The Zapotecs. The Zapotecs formed a civilization that existed in the highlands of the Valley of Oaxaca in southern Mexico from around 1900 BC to the Spanish conquest, and the Zapotec people still exist to this day. They were one of the first Mesoamerican civilizations to adopt writing, built a number of impressive city-states, and produced some pretty incredible art. The Zapotecs initially became sedentary in the early formative period, between 1900 and 850 BC, when hereditary elites emerged and distinguished themselves from peasants by using things like mirrors made of iron ore and ornaments made of jade. The largest of these early villages was San Jose Mogote, which was established sometime before 1800 BC. From 1300 to 950 BC, it grew to become a chiefly center, which boasted multiple satellite communities and even pyramidal temple platforms. It even sent some of its iron ore mirrors to the Olmecs. So we were this close to a Mesoamerican Iron Age. Some pretty big temple platforms were built on San Jose Mogote's hilltop acropolis, but at each phase of its construction, sacrificial victims were added to its fill. Around 600 BC, the town was burnt. Its people chose to retaliate by removing a captive enemy leader's heart, which they then immortalized on a stone, which was laid in a corridor near the main temple, so it could be routinely trampled on. It just so happens that the very earliest examples of Zapotec hieroglyphs appear between the guy's legs, which identifies him as a guy called One Earthquake. That makes it one of the oldest examples of writing in the Americas, and means that Zapotec hieroglyphs are centuries older than their more famous Maya counterparts. Between 500 and 450 BC, people from San Jose Mogote established a new city, now known as Monte Alban, on a mountaintop, 400 meters high. It eventually replaced Mogote as the primary Zapotec city, annihilated rivals like San Martin Tilcajete, and grew to dominate the entire valley of Oaxaca, ultimately boasting a population of over 20,000 people, and hundreds of satellite villages at its apogee during the Classic period, between 200 and 700 AD. The mountaintop it sits on was leveled in order to accommodate the huge plaza at its center, which is bordered by two immense platforms at its north and south ends, connected to the plaza by monumental stairways. But the buildings here are only 5 to 10% of the city. It once spread out across 15 whole square miles. Most of the currently visible architecture is from the site's apogee during the Classic period, between 200 and 700 AD, but they also incorporated some intriguing older elements. For example, some of the earliest features at the site are the late pre-classic danzantes, over 320 stone blocks depicting what were at first thought to be dancers and what are now widely recognized to be mutilated sacrificial victims writhing in pain. So they're not exactly dancing. And there's Building J, a strange arrow-shaped building near the south platform which was possibly aligned with the stars. It also bears text and relief from around the same period as the danzantes, which describe the city's military exploits, accompanied by the upside-down heads of defeated rulers. And beyond this, there was another rather grisly aspect to ancient Zapotec society, their odd penchant for turning human bones into jewelry. Not as trophies of war, but actually mainly to show their connection to their forebears and the authority they had. The skeleton of a man discovered at the site of Mitla around 2010 was found to be totally intact, except that he was missing just one thing, his right femur, which was removed up to 100 years after he was first buried there. But why, you ask? Well, the lintel of an 8th century tomb at the site of Lambert Yeko, Tomb 7, depicts a ruler wielding a femur as a scepter, so it was probably used for something akin to that. The skeletons of 6 rulers were discovered within that same tomb, but curiously, only 3 of their femurs were left. Most strikingly, though, carved and painted human jawbones worn as pendants were discovered at a residential complex at the site of Dainzu in 2015. The same family had lived there for 400 years, so this was probably their handiwork. And they probably did it to their very own long-gone relatives at that. Anyways, back to Monte Alban. Like any good Mesoamerican city, it had a big ball court and towering stelae bearing inscriptions in honor of the city's rulers. In addition, over 170 royal tombs have been found there, many of which contain brightly painted murals. This includes Tomb 104, which you can find an exact replica of in New York in the American Museum of Natural History there. In this picture, you might notice these strange anthropomorphic pots on the ground, which are called effigy vessels or urns. They're mostly found in and around tombs, but also as offerings connected to buildings, and they're really, really rich in iconography, but their exact meanings or functions aren't clear. But they're probably either deities or ancestors in the guise of deities, especially since they seem to depict 9 gods of the underworld and 13 of the sky world, which matches up with Mesoamerican cosmology in general. One of the deities depicted most frequently is the god of rain and lightning, Kosijo, who has a forked tongue like a snake, some jaguar features, and of course a human body. They also had a bat god of fertility, famously represented by this jade mask of a bat-human hybrid, also from Monte Alban. And while mentioning specific works of art from there, I have to mention this amazing piece called The Scribe, which is called that because it sort of resembles all the statues of scribes from Old Kingdom Egypt. Given the name urn, you'd be forgiven for thinking that they housed human remains, and that's what I thought at first, but they're actually usually empty, and at most some contain a few bird bones, so it's possible that they contain food offerings that have just disappeared. But there was actually a monotheistic element to their religion, and these beings on the urns are just the intermediaries of an otherwise inaccessible supreme god. Anyways, back to Monte Alban. Curiously, we know that it was connected with the great city of Teotihuacan. The Zapotecs had their own little neighborhood there, and there are even depictions of ambassadors from Teotihuacan coming to see the inauguration of the South Platform, on the South Platform itself. Monte Alban lost its power between 600 and 900 AD, and its former dominions fragmented into various petty states, which just so happens to be when Teotihuacan was collapsing. It was then taken over by the Mixtecs. They happened to bury some of their own kings there and left amazing gold tomb goods, like the so-called golden pictorial of Monte Alban. It's so unique that when I first saw it, I thought, oh, this must be some movie prop, but no, it's real. But for the Zapotecs, Monte Alban was replaced by the smaller city of Mitla, which nonetheless sports some pretty incredible mosaic friezes, and it was occupied up until the Spanish conquest. It was also the burial place of the last line of independent Zapotec kings, based out of another site called Zachala. The ruling house of Zachal's last king, the last independent Zapotec king period, was named Kosijopi II. He was actually related to the famous Aztec Tlatoani Moctezuma and the Aztec ruling house as a whole through his mother, and acceded to the throne of Zachal's colony at Tehuantepec as a kid in the early 16th century. He was also the brother of a famous Zapotec folk heroine, Princess Donaji, who was executed by the Mixtecs of Monte Alban after they had taken her captive. Her body was miraculously rediscovered because a shepherd boy had plucked some lilies, which were growing from the blood of her head. And even more miraculously, her body was apparently found to be incorrupt, so she was buried in the convent of Santiago Apostol, and a representation of her head with lilies growing from it is still on the coat of arms of Oaxaca. Kosijopi actually allied with the Spanish, notably Cortez's lieutenant, the notoriously gold-hungry Pedro de Alvarado, who was actually able to arrange peace between the Zapotecs and the Mixtecs. As a result, Kosijopi maintained much of his authority, was baptized a Catholic in 1522, maybe only superficially, and took the name Don Juan Cortez. He even built a convent, Santo Domingo, in Tehuantepec. But in his old age, he seems to have reverted back to paganism, and he eventually died while returning to Oaxaca from a heresy trial in Mexico City, where he had been stripped of all his authority. That was in 1563, and by that same year, the Zapotec population had shrunk to as little as 10% of what it had been prior to the arrival of the Spanish, as a result of epidemics and chronic overwork. Since then, the Zapotec people have gone through a lot of hardships, but they're still around. It's thought that the current Zapotec population stands somewhere between 400,000 and 650,000 people, and 500,000 people still speak one of the many Zapotec languages which still survive to the present. And just to finish off, I feel compelled to speedrun through some of the many other spectacular sites left behind by the ancient Zapotecs.
3, 2, 1, go!
There's Dainzu, which is famous for depictions of ball game players or warriors wearing really neat helmets, really similar to what Roman gladiators wore, and of course the bits of jawbone jewelry found there. Then there's Yagul, a mostly post-classic site with nice friezes similar to Mitla's. There's Atzompa, a suburb of Monte Alban containing some amazing tombs. There's Gwengola, a fortified post-classic site which is really close to modern Tehuantepec and I think might have been where Kosajopi actually ruled, I'm not certain. There's Lambatyeko, which contains lots of pristinely preserved stucco art like big masks of Kosicho, these remarkable portraits of a royal couple forever watching over the entrance of their tomb, Tomb 6, and of course the lintel with the thigh-bone scepter. Its peak was from 600 to 750 AD when it became more autonomous as Monte Alban declined, but nevertheless, it was still abandoned around when Monte Alban was. There's Huijazu, known for an incredible classic period tomb called Tomb 5, and finally Etla, which contains rather evocative pyramid mounds still waiting to be excavated and returned to their former glory. Plain of Jars. Yeah, that's what P of J stands for. This refers to the enormous jar-shaped megaliths of north-central Laos, which are incredibly mysterious because we still don't know who exactly made them or when exactly they did it. There exist approximately 2,000 of these jars located across over 100 sites and counting, on hilltops, in rice paddies, and deep within forests, all within Laos's Shangkoang province. They're made of sandstone and granite, and can be upwards of 9 feet tall and can weigh up to 14 tons. The locals claim that a legendary giant king named Kun Cheng won a great battle, and to celebrate his victory, he threw a massive party using rice beer he brewed in the jars. Alternatively, it's possible that they had a very different purpose, to store corpses long enough until their flesh rotted off them, and the remaining bones could be interred or cremated elsewhere. Human skeletons and jars filled with cremated remains have been discovered in burial pits right next to the jars, along with curious limestone boulders and slabs, one of which was perforated and placed over the skull and torso of an individual as if he was looking through it. One of the first scholars to visit the jars in 1912 and 1923, Henri Parmentier, claimed he'd discovered carnelian and glass beads, bronze bells, iron tools, and human bones within the jars. Another important early jar investigator of the 1930s, Madeleine Kalani, also found burnt bones in the jars and evidence of cremation. Unfortunately, it's pretty difficult to excavate around the jars because the region the jars are in is one of the most heavily bombed places on the planet. Back in the 60s, during the Vietnam War, the US Army dropped 4 million pounds of bombs on the region in order to eliminate local communists aligned with the Viet Cong, and the presence of these bombs is still very much felt, and unexploded ordnance still regularly kills scores of people, so as you can imagine, not that many archaeological digs have taken place there. Only 10% of jar sites have been cleaned of these bombs, and some of them even physically damaged the jars. As such, only a select few of the sites are actually open to visitors. 4 kilometers south of the regional capital, Phon Savan, lies the most visited jar site, creatively named Site 1. It features a whopping 316 of them. The jars here were determined to have been taken from a quarry 8 kilometers away, called Site 21, which features some unfinished examples. But the one with the most, Site 52, lies in a forest and was only discovered in 2005. It has 415 jars, and curiously, they're accompanied by a total of 219 stone discs, possibly lids. But the exact age of these megaliths remains a mystery. Well, sort of. People have guessed that they're 2,000 years old, and Kalani believed that they were made by Mon Khmers, who lived there from 500 BC to 300 AD. But recent scientific dating has cleared up the situation a bit, but it's also complicated the narrative even further. Optically stimulated luminescence dating, which shows when something last saw the sun, was applied to sediments, which were carefully taken from below 4 of the jars, from 2 sites, Site 2 and Site 52. It turns out that the dirt from under the jars last saw the sun between 1240 BC and 660 BC. So these jars were initially put there thousands of years earlier than initially thought. But strangely enough, radiocarbon dating of skeletal remains and charcoal samples from the burials around the jars date to between the 9th and 13th centuries AD, so like 2,500 years later in the Middle Ages. And complicating the situation even further, besides these odd outliers, is the fact that a skull sample obtained by earlier archaeologists was dated to before the dirt samples, to between 2282 and 1265 BC, so ultimately no one really knows when exactly these jars were made. An aspect of the mystery that a lot of sources fail to mention, despite being an important piece of the puzzle, is the fact that these aren't actually the only megalithic jars in Southeast Asia. There's another group of them in the Khasi Hills of Assam and the adjoining Jaintia district of Meghalaya in eastern India. There are around 500 of them, and they're often found in rows, and like the Laotian jars, they're also thought to have been used as ossuaries and are often accompanied by flat-sitting stones. They were probably built by a people known as the Khasi and a subgroup of theirs known as the Jaintia or Sintang, who of course gave their names to the regions where the jars are, and they're really interesting. They speak a Mon Khmer language, and as late as the 19th century, they erected hundreds of these huge standing stones and flat horizontal dolmens in honor of their male and female dead, respectively, even though now they're actually majority Christian. The most notable cluster of these more modern megaliths are at a place called Nartiang, once the capital of the Jaintiapur Kingdom. Like the people who built the jars in Laos, the Khasis also put their ancestors' bones in repositories. It's possible that the people who built the Assam jars went east and built the Laos jars based on genetic studies of Austroasiatic populations conducted in 2007, which suggests that they went through northeast India to get to Southeast Asia. But it's also possible that the people who built the jars in Laos went west and became the Khasi, because a 2011 study said that the Khasi came to the Khasi Hills from Southeast Asia, possibly pushed there by the ancestors of the Tibeto-Burman speakers, who also live in the region, like the Biate people. On the contrary, the Biates themselves claim that their ancestors used the jars to store rice beer during feasts, so exactly what the Laotians say about their jars. So the huge jars in both Laos and India remain shrouded in mystery. The Mississippians. As the name might suggest, this civilization existed far closer to home for the majority of you living in the good old US of A. People don't often associate ancient civilizations with the American Midwest or Southeast, but one heck of a civilization once thrived there between roughly 900 and 1450 AD, and its people are known as the Mississippians. The most obvious reminders we have of them are their cities, which were built around ceremonial plazas bordered by pyramidal, flat-topped earthen mounds with temples and rulers' residences atop them, notably similar to the cities of Mesoamerica. The most important of these cities was Cahokia, just across the Mississippi from St. Louis. The most impressive and well-known structure there is called Monk's Mound, and it's both the largest monument the Mississippians ever built and the largest pyramid north of Mesoamerica, being a whopping 1,000 feet long, 700 feet wide, and 100 feet high, and it has 26 million cubic feet of earth within it. Cahokia had a population of 10 to 20,000 people at its peak in the 11th and 12th centuries, and it exerted tremendous influence over all other Mississippian centers, as it was the birthplace of what's known as the Southeastern Cultural Complex, which also goes by the more metal name, the Southern Death Cult. It was a series of shared Mississippian traits, like certain artifacts and symbols, which accompanied the implementation of chiefdoms likely led by priest rulers, the mounds of course, and intensive maize cultivation, made possible because they were around during the medieval warm period from 950 to 1250. Some of these traits include what's been called long-nose masquettes, which weren't used as masks, they were used as earrings, the same cross and circle motif the Bellbeaker people really liked, and other striking symbols like the eye and hand motif, which might have also represented a portal to the underworld. They also really liked a game called Chunky, which is like horseshoes except with a moving target, and instead of horseshoes, you use big circular stones. Another feature of the Southeastern Cultural Complex is an avatar of warriors known as the Birdman, depicted here on this copper plate. Even though they still use stone to craft their tools and weapons, like these ritual dancing swords, they used the copper they got from around the Great Lakes to create beautiful, decorative artwork. They also liked using shells, and used them to carve ornate pendants referred to as gorgets. Starting in Cahokia, they also produced some pretty lively stone statues, like the flint clay Berger figurine from Cahokia itself. These guys from the site of Etowah and the effigy pipes from the mounds of Spiro. Speaking of these other sites, I should probably skim over the various regional variants of Mississippian culture, and the cool sites they encompassed, which could be neat stops on your next road trip. The middle Mississippian culture was at the Mississippian culture's wider core in the central Mississippi Valley, the lower Ohio Valley, and much of the Mid-South. Its most impressive sites include Cahokia, of course, Moundville in Alabama, and Angel Mounds in Indiana. The South Appalachian Mississippian culture spanned across much of the southeast and includes major sites like Etowah, featuring 3 imposing pyramid mounds at its center, and Okmulgee. The Caddoan Mississippian culture, the ancestors of the modern Caddo people and languages, covered eastern Oklahoma, western Arkansas, northwestern Louisiana, and even northeastern Texas. Their major sites include the Battle Mound site in Arkansas, which has its largest mound, measuring 670 feet long and 34 feet high, Spiro in Oklahoma, known for its remarkable effigy pipes, and the only Mississippian site in Texas, the Caddo Mound site. The Plaquemine culture existed in eastern Louisiana and western Mississippi, with sites like Emerald Mound. It features the largest Mississippian mound after Monk's Mound, which is 770 by 345 feet at its base and 35 feet high. And it even has a spattering of secondary mounds on top of it. There's also Winterville, Holly Bluff, and Anna. And finally, the Upper Mississippians existed around the Great Lakes, the most notable site of theirs being the Cahokian colony of Aztlan in Wisconsin, named after the legendary Aztec homeland of Aztlan, which some people seriously thought it was at some point. The Mississippians intermixed with the locals to create the Oneota culture, but they also replaced the old custom of creating effigy mounds, which I think is a shame because they look really cool, like an American version of the Nazca Lines. In case you're wondering what this thing at the top right is, the Fort Ancient culture concentrated in southern Ohio was similar to Mississippian culture, but differed enough that it's mostly considered its own thing. But there was also a darker side to Mississippian culture, exemplified by the otherwise unassuming Mound 72 in Cahokia. It contained one of the richest burials ever found from pre-Columbian North America, that of a man who was buried on a mat made out of 20,000 shell beads from the Gulf Coast, in the shape of a falcon, which is why it's nicknamed the Birdman Burial. But the mound as a whole contained multiple mass graves containing a total of 272 individuals, 2/3 of which are thought to have been ritually sacrificed to accompany the other third, possibly belonging to some elite family. These people were sacrificed violently generation after generation over the course of a century, and there's even evidence of people being buried alive. And that brutality ultimately may have bit Cahokia's elites in the ass later on. Because with elites like that, I don't blame the people of Cahokia for what happened next. By 1150, presumably due to increasing conflict, a big palisade wall was built around Cahokia's core, and a site within its vicinity, now where East St. Louis is, was burnt. After another 50 years, the population dropped, and after limping on until 1350, the site was totally abandoned. It's possible that the elite's inability to resolve drought and the end of the medieval warm period that had ushered the culture in led to their people losing faith in them, so sorta like what the Moche might have gone through. Other areas elsewhere, like the area around Nashville for example, which was once occupied by tons of mounds, all since destroyed, and Illinois, would continue gradually declining until 1450, when populations dropped and commerce came to a halt. Possibly because of the climate cooling dramatically yet again and affecting the growing season. Or maybe even an epidemic, or maybe conflict. Or maybe them all rolled into one big shitstorm, who knows. Most southeastern Indian nations are the descendants of the Mississippians. For example, the Cherokee, Choctaw, Creek, and other nations built platform mounds for their council houses. A group in Mississippi, known as the Natchez in particular, possess one of the only mound sites, called Natchez Grand Village, where Mississippian mounds were used into historic times, though many other Mississippian sites seem to have been inhabited after Hernando de Soto became the first European to visit the South in the 1540s. And that's the end of the video. Thank you so much for watching, I hope you all enjoyed, and now it's time to thank my patrons. There's Dhruv Singhal, Booga420, Ronnie G, Bajun, Julia Erickson, Harrison Timperley, Danny Banani, Doc Bossman, Daniel, Kevin Ryan, Ayanami Amamami, Bomb Tombadil, Hugo S., Rose Klein, and our new patrons, James Kirk, Hugh DePayne, and Alyssa P. Thank you so much for supporting my channel. I couldn't continue without you guys. Also, I might just be starting an honest-to-goodness radio show soon, so have your eyes peeled for news about that. Goodbye.